Mr. Farman.
Good morning. May I please call Patricia Temple, who will be sworn?
Would you repeat after me? I swear by Almighty God. That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Could you please give your full name?
Patricia Ann Temple.
Ms Temple, you have given a witness statement dated the 14th of June 2024. That's INQ 304866012. Ms Temple, you have been a qualified registered nurse working in various countries since 1972. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is it correct that from March to November 2020, you worked as a Band 5 nurse in a cardiac care unit of an NHS trust?
That's correct.
Could you tell the inquiry first what a Band 5 nurse is and what your role in the cardiac care unit involved?
A Band 5 nurse is a registered nurse at the first level, and I worked providing bedside care to patients, both COVID patients and non-COVID patients, and primarily those with cardiac problems.
Going back to March 2020, what was your daily working pattern like?
I worked full-time night duty at weekends.
You mentioned that you cared for both COVID and non-COVID patients. While working in the cardiac care unit, were you always aware of whether or not you were caring for COVID or non-COVID patients?
Not always. Sometimes patients had not evidenced symptoms of COVID when they were admitted. Some patients were admitted as suspect COVID patients and only proved to be COVID positive at a later stage once their test results were back. So at various stages we were not aware that the patients were COVID positive or not.
Was there a specific COVID-19 positive ward in your hospital?
There was, yes.
Were staff from your ward ever called upon to care for patients in the COVID-19 positive ward?
Yes, it depended on whether staffing levels in the COVID positive ward were actually at appropriate levels or not. And if not, then if our ward had what they consider to be sufficient staff, they would float, is the word that we use, to another ward to supplement staffing levels in that ward.
When that took place, would those staff who had floated, to use your word, ever return to, or return relatively quickly to your ward, the cardiac care unit?
We would be floated for a shift.
And return the next shift to?
Yes, return to your ward the next shift. So it would only be for a shift.
So there was no break time in terms of no time off after having spent time within a COVID-19 ward to account for the fact that the nurse had spent time in that ward and may well have potentially been exposed to COVID-19?
No.
With respect to infection prevention and control, you say in your statement at paragraph 5 that policies seem to change daily and at times did not seem to adhere to the normally accepted infection prevention and control guidelines. What do you mean by this?
I think that the one particular incident that I said was we were told on a Friday that we were to wear masks starting on Monday, which seemed to me a strange thing to do.
Why?
Because if we're going to be wearing masks from Monday, surely we should be wearing them now. It seemed to make no sense at all.
Did you feel as though the management and those in charge of infection prevention and control within the hospital were forthcoming with information about the level of risk that
I don't think so, no. Initially, I think that we got the impression that we weren't being told everything. I have no idea whether that was deliberate or not. but it appeared that we weren't being told about everything that was going on, particularly as it related to COVID-positive patients and how many there were, and potential issues with COVID-positive patients.
What gave you that impression that information was being withheld?
Just that it was very difficult to extract information about anything if you asked questions about how many COVID-positive patients there were and what was happening pandemic-wise in the trust that I worked with.
Did you feel that there was sufficient clarity around what protective equipment, PPE, you should be wearing?
No, there was confusion, I feel.
Was confusion related to the type of PPE that
yes,
you should
definitely. There was confusion as to whether surgical masks were adequate as opposed to FFP masks, and whether initially we were told that surgical masks were fine for everything, except for patients who were having aerosol-generating procedures. And in the early stages of the pandemic, the unit that I was in was declared a white unit, so that we weren't supposed to be admitting COVID-positive patients. But as the beds in the remainder of the hospital became scarce, then we did start admitting COVID-positive patients. And we were told then that only with aerosol-generating procedures were we to wear FFP masks for the added protection. But otherwise, surgical masks were adequate.
You make clear in your witness statement that you had been fit tested for one type of FFP3 mask in 2019. Were you able to wear this type of mask in those circumstances in which it would have been advised that you wear an FFP3?
Yes. Except that I found that out in retrospect after I contracted COVID, and when I investigated it a little bit further, I found out in retrospect that in actual fact the mask for which I had been fit tested was actually withdrawn from the trust and put back into general stocks in the NHS, I believe, in July of that year. But that was just, I had no evidence of that. That was just hearsay from someone who was actually organising the mask fitting for me, told me that mask had been removed. We were not advised of that.
So do you actually know whether or not the mask that you were wearing, the FFP3 that you were wearing, was one that you had been fit tested for?
It wasn't. It was initially until those became unavailable, and then FFP masks that were available I used. But later on in the November, shortly before I acquired COVID, I discovered that in actual fact the masks that were available in the unit, they fit tested me. They came around with a new computerized testing system for fit testing masks. And we found that all the masks, other than one, which I had never seen before on the unit, that none of the masks were actually suitable for purpose in relation to me. So it became clear to me that obviously I was not adequately protected during the time.
You were wearing an FFP3 mask, but not one
yes.
which adequately fit your face.
No. But we did, in terms of aerosol-generating procedures, shortly before I became ill, I actually was caring for a patient on aerosol-generating procedures, whom I remember really clearly. In that instance, we took all our precautions. We put FFP masks, we put visors, and we took full precautions as we were advised to do. But it was difficult.
What was it about the masks, when you weren't having the visor and everything else, what was it about the masks that meant that they weren't giving you the sufficient protection? Why were they found unsuitable?
There's leakage, I believe, so that they tested it on the computer to see whether it actually... In previous tests, what they did was they put the mask on and then they injected a smell, some sort of, so that you could smell it and see. And if you could, then it meant that the mask wasn't effective. But in this instance, the computer told us that it actually didn't provide adequate protection. It gave you percentage protection, I believe. Some of them gave minimal percentage protections. And the last one that they tested on me, which was, I believe, called the stealth mask, was the one that gave adequate protection. But in actual fact, I never tested that again because I was ill shortly thereafter. And when I came back from my sick leave, I actually didn't nurse COVID patients again, simply because I felt that it was not possible for me to do so.
To be clear, you found out this detail about the accuracy after you had been nursing patients wearing FFP3 masks,
yes.
which turned out not to be sufficiently protective for you. Is that right?
That's correct.
Is it right that in your hospital there was an infection prevention and control team?
There was.
Did your working pattern, which you mentioned earlier, working consistently night duties, impact your ability to engage with that team?
It did. I was fortunate in as much as the Education and Training Department came round to those of us on night duty during November 2020 and actually provided us with mask fitting tests, and that's how I established that in actual fact the masks that I had been using were not fit for purpose.
What was your experience like of infection prevention and control measures in staff areas? Did people tend to keep their masks on in staff areas, or did they take them off? What was the general impression that you got from work?
I think we tried to keep them on, but it was difficult in staff areas like when you went for your breaks to actually keep your masks on while you ate and drank. And it was difficult as well to keep masks on if you were at the nurse's station, for instance. That was the most difficult area, I think, to remain infection aware because there were so many of us coming and going.
Was this the case for both the surgical fluid-resistant masks and FFP3 masks, or particularly the case when you'd been wearing an FFP3 mask?
I think we wore the surgical masks routinely and the FFP3 masks only when indicated.
So there wasn't any particular issue in relation to FFP3 masks having to be taken off. It was in fact the case that even with the surgical masks, people were taking them off in staff areas.
Yes.
Was there anything that you think could have been done to improve compliance with infection prevention and control, particularly in staff areas?
I think if issues had been explained better, if people had actually made themselves available for those of us on night duty. I felt that there was general confusion surrounding infection control practices and what the best things to do were. It was relating as well to how many people would be in one area at a time. You know, there was no one explained the sort of science behind it, like there could only be 3 people there, or there could only be 2 people there, or 4 people there. And it didn't seem to be based on anything scientific. So it was difficult to adhere to principles that were, I suppose, questionable. That I have been nursing for a long period of time, so I have infection control principles sort of imprinted in my brain, and some of them really didn't seem to make sense and were difficult to adhere to because of that, I feel.
Regardless of what the guidance was, would you have then appreciated some more explanation as to
Yes.
how
Yes.
the guidance had been reached? Did you feel that you had adequate access to testing for COVID-19?
I think so, yes. I can't remember that there was any problem with that, although people were reluctant to be tested because of the implications if you went off sick. Particularly, I think, financial implications. if you went off sick and you didn't have sick leave available, there was, a reluctance perhaps to go off sick. So there might have been a reluctance to be tested just for that reason.
Did you encounter staff avoiding testing?
I don't think anyone actually refused to be tested, but they did try and avoid it as much as was possible, I think, because of the having to go off sick and the financial implications thereof.
One aspect of infection prevention and control, which the inquiry has heard a lot about, is the visiting restrictions which were imposed. From your perspective as a nurse, someone who's been nursing for many years, what was the impact of having to impose visiting restrictions on patients and their families?
That was really sad. I found it really, really sad. I remember well one patient that we heard talking to his mum on the phone, a learning disabled man who couldn't understand why she couldn't come and see him, and he was dying. And you could hear him speaking on the phone to his mum and asking her to come. That was devastating for all of us, because we have an obligation as nurses to care for our patients, to empathise with them and to be there with them. And it was very, very difficult to see them suffering without their loved ones there. It was difficult for us as well to see them dying alone.
Did you feel you had the flexibility to adjust the rules to individual circumstances?
No.
You note at paragraph 10 of your witness statement that staff who did test positive were advised to return to work as soon as possible and made to feel guilty if they did not. Where did this pressure to return to work come from?
I'm not sure whether it actually came from management or it came from nurses themselves. We ourselves are very obligated to our team members and our colleagues. And sometimes I think we probably put an inordinate amount of pressure on ourselves to actually get back and not let our team down. So I think it possibly came from management because of staff shortages, and we were well aware that how short staffing was. So we were reluctant to let our team down and let our patients down.
You say at paragraph 19 of your witness statement this: "We expected the NHS and management would look after us as required. I fear they failed to do so." Can you elaborate a little on your concerns there?
I think there were systemic failures. I think that's the big thing. I'm very much a quality improvement person, and in quality improvement you look at the systems. And I think that if you looked at the system that was put in place to deal with COVID, there were failures and failures and failures. And I think they let us down as nurses about many things.
Anything in particular?
I think infection prevention and control, particularly. I think with myself in terms of long COVID and looking after me when I developed long COVID, that was really difficult. I had to fight really, really hard to get any support from management in terms of long COVID. I had to try, I tried redeployment on a number of occasions, and that failed. But there could have been far more support, I feel, and far more adjustments made. And I feel very strongly for the long COVID nurses that are out there now that are having to take ill health dismissal. It was less difficult for me, I think, because I had come nearer the end of my career than the beginning, but there are a lot of nurses out there that are beginning their careers and have had to take dismissal due to ill health. And that makes me feel that they consider nurses disposable. And I think that's where they let us down, particularly.
Did there ever come a point whilst you were working when the vaccine became available?
It did, yes.
Did there come a point at your hospital, it may not have, but did there come a point where it was proposed that taking the vaccine was a condition of deployment?
It was, yes. Although that didn't affect me particularly at that time. My main decision was to take the vaccine was after I had been put on sick leave due to long COVID. And I lived alone in the UK. My family are in Israel and South Africa. And I desperately needed to go somewhere to be looked after. And the only reason I took the vaccine, I think, was so that I could travel. And that's an honest opinion.
From the perspective of you and other staff, from your perspective and other staff's perspective, the proposition of having a policy that required staff to take the vaccine in order to be deployed as nurses, did that have any impact on staff morale?
It did, I think, but I think that if I remember two nurses particularly that were very certain that they were not prepared to have the vaccine, and as far as I'm aware, were still allowed to continue to work. I think it possibly became a condition of employment, but possibly that was by the time I had long COVID and was no longer at work. It might well have done. But we were still able to refuse.
You've touched on your experiences briefly in relation to contracting COVID and developing long COVID. Am I right that you understand or you believe that you contracted COVID at work?
Yes.
Do you know when you contracted COVID or how?
From that patient that I was talking about, that I nursed in the 7 to 10 days prior to becoming ill. And I remember him well because it became such that we were unable to continue to nurse him on the ward that he was on, and we moved him to the respiratory unit where he subsequently died, much to my regret, because I knew that he too would die alone.
After you contracted COVID, did you have some time at home isolating alone?
Until it became such that I had phone calls from everybody to tell me that I had to go to hospital. But I was of the firm belief that we were told that you had to isolate at home for 10 days, that whatever you did, please not to go to hospital because it would further confound the problems that they were having at the hospital. So I stayed at home for an exceptionally long time. I actually stayed at home for 10 days until I was actually ambulanced to hospital because I was seriously ill.
How long were you admitted to hospital for?
11 days.
Were you then discharged home and were you able to then return to work?
I tried to return to work I did a trial of return to work in the January of 2021 and then had to leave in March of 2021 simply because I couldn't maintain my oxygen saturation levels at an appropriate level to function and to breathe. And I also had an inappropriate tachycardia that I couldn't manage a full day's work.
What was that period of time trying to work as a nurse, something you've done for many, many years, but simply being unable to do it to the standard that you previously had been able to? What was that like? It
was 6 very difficult weeks because I tried my best to manage and not let my team down, because that's very important to me, that one doesn't let one's colleagues down.
When did you recognise that you had, in fact, developed long COVID?
Well, I felt that I had developed something a long time before I got the diagnosis because a lot of people poo-pooed the idea of long COVID, and I believe still do. But I knew that there was something wrong with me in as much as I couldn't breathe, and I had difficulty with extremely serious fatigue and was just not able to function on a daily basis. To even get around and do my shopping was very difficult. I just found difficulty with normal everyday tasks.
Did you eventually manage to access a long COVID clinic?
I did, but after, yes, I went to there was a long COVID hub, and I managed to get hold of a respiratory physiotherapist that came and visited me at home. And they established that I had ongoing symptoms of COVID and that I had respiratory issues. And I eventually travelled to South Africa, where my daughter was, and consulted other physicians there, and discovered that I had permanent lung damage from COVID.
You say in your statement that you feel more should have been done from your employer's perspective to create a supportive environment for nurses while they recover from COVID-19 or indeed long COVID if they've developed it. What do you feel could have been done to support you?
I think people could have kept in touch more. As it were, I lived alone, and I did have friends, obviously, that kept in touch with me, but in terms of work, they didn't keep in touch with me as much as I think they might have. I think there are standards that are set when you're on sick leave, but I think it caught them unawares the fact that long COVID would go on for quite so long. So people found it difficult from a management perspective, I think, to keep on touching base with you to see how you were. And I think there should be a much more robust system of looking after people at home when they have long COVID.
You ultimately were required, weren't you, to take ill health dismissal?
I was.
When was that?
September 2023.
After everything you've experienced, have you been able to, in any form, resume nursing?
Not bedside nursing at all, but I'm a nurse and always will be a nurse, so I am now working with one-to-one nursing students online to help them with their academic work, and also preparing an online program for nurses who are compassion fatigued, as I think many of us are, particularly post-pandemic.
You finish your statement with these words: nurses should not be viewed as disposable, and every attempt should be made to retain this valuable resource. Are there any recommendations beyond which you've already touched on that you think ought to be borne in mind by the inquiry to ensure that nurses are better protected in the event of a future pandemic?
I think you have to learn the lessons from this pandemic, what has happened from this pandemic, and why so many nurses actually contracted COVID and then long COVID. So that lessons should be learned, and I hope that what this inquiry does is to learn those lessons and put them into place in the future. But I also would like, in terms of long COVID nurses, is they are still willing to nurse, and they still could nurse in many, many different capacities. So can we not make reasonable adjustments and allow them to continue in their nursing capacity? I have a lot of nurses that I know who are trying very, very hard to stay in the workplace and are unable to do so. And that's something that I think should be seriously looked at and learned from, so that they are a valuable resource. They're not disposable. Having COVID and long COVID, you can't be clapped for 1 minute and declared disposable the next.
Thank you very much, Ms. Temple. My lady, those are all my questions.
Mr Temple, thank you very much indeed. I don't have any questions for you. You and I qualified in the same year, in 1972. So to see your dedication to your profession after so many years is inspiring. And I'm really sorry that you've had to suffer the impact of long COVID. It's obviously been a great blow to you to give up nursing in the wards. But you're obviously doing a huge amount of work supporting other nurses online, and we're really grateful to you for all that you did during the pandemic and that you continue to do in supporting nurses.
Thank you very much.
For that.
Thank you.
Ms. Carey.
My lady, the next witness, please, is Mrs. Rosemary Gallagher.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Mrs. Gallagher, your full name, please.
Rosemary Gallagher.
I think you are known as Rose at work, and indeed we look at some emails and we'll see you signing off as such. Mrs. Gallagher, you're coming to give evidence today as the professional lead for infection prevention and control at the Royal College of Nursing. And I hope you have in front of you your witness statement dated the 25th of April, 475580.
I do.
Lovely. May we start with a little background, please? Firstly, to you. Just help us, what does the professional lead for IPC at the RCN do?
I'm a registered nurse and I'm a specialist nurse working in infection prevention and control. My role essentially is to advise the college and its members on matters relating to infection prevention and control, but specifically in the context of nursing practice. And
presumably, therefore, were rather busy during the relevant period dealing with the IPC guidance. We're going to come on and look at some of the guidance and indeed some of the RCN's concerns about the IPC guidance during the course of your evidence. May I just ask you, please, though, to give us an overview of the role of the RCN?
Yes, so the RCN, the Royal College of Nursing, has a dual function. It was established first as a Royal College in 1929 and therefore acts as a professional body for nursing, focusing on professional nursing standards, health policy, and advice and support for its members. It's also a trade union and therefore has the additional role and ability to support its members in relation to employment relations, queries or issues.
Can we start then with one of the major concerns of the RCN as set out in your statement, which is that relating to lack of engagement with the RCN and indeed other stakeholders, particularly, you say, in reviewing, updating and indeed developing the IPC guidance. Just help us, please, if you're able, which bodies did the RCN want to engage with?
In the early days of the pandemic, the development of guidance would have been led by Public Health England in collaboration with the other countries and main stakeholders. And our experience in previous incidents had been that Royal Colleges and nursing was around the table in terms of considering the impact of that guidance on those that would implement it.
Why do you say, on behalf of the RCN, that it's so important for the RCN to be engaged with when IPC guidance is being developed?
Well, there are a number of reasons that support our position. First of all, we had learnt as I said, through a number of prior incidents, that it was absolutely critical for people that needed to use the evidence in practice and to implement it were actually involved in its development. And that was a key outcome from the Ebola incident and review. Our members also work across a variety of health and care settings, both in the NHS, adult social care and independent settings. But they're also present in prisons, they work in mental health settings. So it's really important that there isn't a one-size-fits-all guidance. Certainly it can be based on principles, but it has to be implemented in the context of where those nurses are working. So for us to be around the table, whilst I might not wear my specialist infection prevention and control hat, I would bring with me that experience of nurses and look at how it could be implemented in the various settings.
I think you said a moment ago that there was difficulty certainly with engagement in the early days, by which I mean March, April, that kind of time of 2020. And how did it improve, if indeed it did, after the initial months of the pandemic?
Well, in the early stages, we didn't have specific concerns around the COVID-19 guidance or the Wuhan guidance, as it was known at that point, because it was being treated as a high consequence infectious disease. And therefore it followed the high consequence disease management. It wasn't until after SARS-CoV-2 was downgraded from a high consequence infectious disease that our concerns really started to be raised or to come to the forefront.
Was there better engagement in wave 2 or 3?
The level of engagement really varied. We tried to be very proactive in terms of offering our support as a Royal College. This was very much about a one-team approach to managing the profession, the pandemic, and ensuring that all healthcare professionals, because our responsibility as nurses, excuse me, is clearly to our patients, but we have responsibility for the colleagues that work alongside us as well. So we wanted to make sure that that professional voice was there and heard, both to enable us to be confident that it could be implemented, but also to support communication and to feed in any intelligence from the front line that could shape it.
When you say there was a level of engagement varied, a level of engagement with whom?
The majority of my personal contact, was with the leads in NHS England who were leading the NHS IPC cell. The countries, because the RCN is a UK-wide organisation and we have 4 regions, the 4 countries, they would also have had relationships with their respective devolved partners and potentially their IPC leads as well in individual conversations.
We've heard evidence from Lisa Ritchie, who was at one stage the chair of the UK IPC cells. Was it people like her and those that made up the IPC cell that you were engaging with?
Yes, I would have gone to Lisa directly and may have, or there was an email address for the UK IPC cell where a lot of the inquiries went. But I would also contact Lisa directly as a contemporary and national leader in IPC.
Can I ask, what's the impact or the downside, whichever word you prefer, of a lack of engagement with the nurses when reviewing and developing IPC guidance?
What became very clear in this incident, which was different from previous incidents, was that not only in its scale, but also our members were able to watch on the television and see what was happening in Europe before it came to the United Kingdom. So our members were very aware of seeing other nurses in other countries wearing respiratory protective equipment. Whilst here, after SARS-CoV-2 was downgraded, they were offered primarily surgical face masks. So it was a matter of confusion, and also there was a sense of a lack of confidence around the focus on their protection and a lack of understanding on why the UK appeared to be taking a different approach to other countries dealing with the same science and the same organism.
How did that lack of understanding or the confusion that the nurses felt actually play out on the ground. Are you able to speak to that at all?
So we had many, many inquiries from nurses across health and adult social care settings asking us to explain or to rationalise the difference in levels of PPE. Nurses are expert in their practice and their patients. And when they started to raise real concerns, particularly around specific procedures such as nasogastric tube insertion, or when they're very close up to patients, they started to express doubt about the predominance of the droplet or mode of transmission. So they came to us, they contacted us through RCN Direct, they contacted various people individually, and they wrote to us as well, raising their concerns.
I suppose it may be said that in the early days of the pandemic, there simply wasn't time for the level of engagement that the RCN would have wished for. But making such allowances as you feel able, do you think in the event of a future pandemic, there needs to be engagement from the get-go, if I can put it like that?
Absolutely. I mean, we all understand that in a pandemic situation, which is very fast-moving and big, that there is a requirement to act fast. What I would say is that there was professional engagement with the swine flu pandemic in 2009. We all understood we had to turn documents around very quickly and attend meetings, and indeed everybody did that, and we achieved multi-professional collaboration. We simply didn't understand why that engagement did not happen in this situation, given it was another pandemic, albeit a different organism.
And just finally on this topic, I'm asked to ask you this. Do you think that any future guidance issued by the IPC cell would be more accurate or better received if there had been not just engagement with the RCN, but perhaps with independent health providers like the independent ambulance sector?
Yeah.
Do you think that would have been of benefit?
Certainly. I mean, the College of Paramedics and other organisations would have been incredibly valuable to have, because the context of risk to them is very different than it is to a nurse on the ward, and they would have provided a different perspective. But I would also just add that what was really needed was some form of implementation plan, given that time was short, and a communication plan. And because we weren't involved, we weren't able to pursue those asks. And I think communication was a real issue in terms of the frontline health workers understanding why they needed to do what they needed to do.
And who do you think should be responsible for an implementation plan and or a communication plan?
I'm not certain. It should be part of that whole management of writing guidance. There was an incredible amount of guidance written, both IPC and non-IPC. So having a governance and risk cell that could support, identify issues around implementation and communication plans would have been very helpful.
One other matter you mention in relation to engagement is you say that the RCN is not a member of the Academy of Medical Royal
correct.
Colleges, and therefore was often excluded from key meetings when previously you have been involved in the meetings. Do you know why the RCN was excluded from various meetings in the pandemic?
I don't. Certainly, we have a good relationship with the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, and we have attended meetings at their request, but during the pandemic, it appeared that it was only the Medical Royal Colleges around the table. It's absolutely critical that nursing, as the largest part of the professional workforce, is there, and we are as able to provide insight and intelligence and critical thinking to those situations as our medical colleagues are as well.
Now, you've touched on concerns about RPE
Yes.
already, and I think you say your paragraph 12 that it was the RCN's wish for RPE for healthcare workers, including nurses, obviously, and for what you call the adoption of the precautionary approach, rather than just saying there was no evidence to justify why IPC was not changed. Can you just expand on that in a nutshell, please, and encapsulate the RCN's concerns.
The guidance was predicated on influenza guidance, which had continued how we had practiced at the time, which was a predominance of surgical face masks. We knew that SARS-CoV-2 was a coronavirus and that previous coronaviruses of high significance, such as SARS and MERS-CoV, were both classified as airborne infections. Now, without getting into the semantics, when you talk about something as airborne, healthcare professionals are able to visualise what that means and are therefore able to easily understand why they need to do what they need to do: ventilation, open windows, respiratory protective equipment, whatever. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
No, I was asking you about the RCN's concerns about the RPE,
yes,
or the lack thereof.
Yes, so to have this dominance of surgical face masks when we were dealing with what was an airborne high-consequence infectious disease, other coronavirus infections classified as airborne, the two did not meet. And we also knew that surgical face masks did not protect adequately against airborne particles, aerosols from the Health and Safety Executive themselves. So we were really concerned about the level of protection that was being advised. We were equally mindful that actually wearing RPE for long periods of time is not good to be, to work in those situations. So we needed clarity and we needed discussion and debate on how best to protect healthcare workers, given those various tensions.
Mm. Can I ask you then, how does the RCN think that tension should be resolved? You want it, but you don't want to wear it all the time. I understand that, but is there a middle ground?
So the middle ground, we have to look at the level of risk, and we are legally bound to look at the level of risk and manage that through existing legislation, which primarily comes under health and safety and Kosh. So that was the driving force at that time, and Kosh remained in place throughout the pandemic and therefore was a natural place to go to in terms of how to protect healthcare workers. The equipment that we had to manage that risk was what we had at the time, which was single-use predominantly respiratory protective equipment, or FFP3s.
Yeah. Right. Now, I think in your statement you go on to make observations about PPE being reused, out-of-date PPE. There are problems that Her Ladyship's already familiar with in terms of fit testing,
yes,
and sheer number of masks that need to, FFP3 that needs to be fit tested. And so I just wanted to put all of those into the round, because I would like to ask you, please, Mrs. Gallagher, about two of the surveys that the RCN conducted. One in April and then another one in May 2020, which really bring to the fore the concerns of your members in relation to PPE. So can we start with the April 2021? And could we have up on screen, please, INQ 114401? The survey was conducted over the Easter bank holiday weekend in April 2020, as I understand it.
That's correct.
And there were 13,605 replies. I ought to have asked you, it's my fault, how many members are there of the RCN?
At the time, we had just under 500,000.
Right, okay. So it's a large number of responders, but actually not a huge number of your members.
It's a proportion of our
as
membership.
A proportion,
yeah.
All right. But it was a UK-wide survey, as we can see there. Majority of respondents worked in England, 11% in Scotland, 4% in Northern Ireland and Wales, 5% identified as having a disability, predominantly females who replied, and we can see the ethnicity breakdown of those 13,500 that responded. All right. And can please we go to page 6 of the survey? And set out there really is a number of the concerns of the majority of respondents, 11,300 of them, who worked in environments with patients with confirmed or possible COVID, that does not involve undertaking high-risk procedures. Yes. Do you mean AGPs by that, or is that?
Yes, we didn't have major concerns around nurses working in, say, intensive care facilities because the ventilation tended to be quite good and they were well used to using RPE.
Yeah. And you can see there what PPE was required to be worn. And then on the section below saying access to enough supplies, 30% of respondents said there was not enough face protection for them for the duration of their shift. 28% they have enough now but are concerned for the supply for their next shift.
Yes.
1 in 4 said there was not enough fluid-resistant surgical face masks for the duration of the shift. And again, a quarter of those were concerned about the next shift. And 14% said they were lacking surgical masks. 32% said they had enough surgical masks for them for the duration of the shift, but are concerned again about the next shift. The least shortage was with aprons and gloves. So over the course of that weekend, there's still a fair proportion of the responders concerned about face and eye protection and FRSMs. And that was fairly early on in the pandemic. Easter,
that was April 2020.
April 2020. And if we go to page 14 of the survey, I think some more general concerns were outlined. So anecdotal evidence from our members revealed that they were concerned with being pressured by their employers to care for confirmed or possible COVID patients without suitable PPE. You received calls about that from the members. The purpose of the survey was to understand how far nursing professionals had access to materials and facilities to help address infection control. We asked about the extent to which nurses were able to raise concerns, how they did that, and whether those concerns had been addressed. You can see there, half of the respondents said that during COVID pandemic, they felt pressure to care for a patient without adequate protection as outlined in the current PPE guidance. And 1 in 5 of the respondents, almost 1 in 5, has had issues with PPE due to specific individual needs such as disabilities, religious and cultural practices, having facial hair, and wearing glasses. The overriding issue related to PPE was for those wearing spectacles.
Yes.
And what was the problem with if you're a glass wearer?
So if you were provided with a visor, it may not have been so much of a problem, but certainly with the protective goggles and wearing spectacles underneath, there were real practical issues, and the goggles didn't fit properly over the spectacles. So for a nurse, for example, that could have impacted on their ability to read prescriptions, for example, dispensing medications, and also the fact that the goggles potentially the members felt weren't actually protecting them appropriately.
Can I ask you this? That doesn't sound like a new problem. Is there any kind of goggle that does work over glass wearers?
We don't tend to wear goggles in general practice. If we need eye protection, it tends to be either a visor that goes over our faces with a mask or an integral surgical face mask with a visor as part of it.
And we're familiar, I'm afraid, with the issue around fit testing for FFP2 and FFP3 masks, and indeed those that had failed the fit test due to having too small a face, wearing a hijab or a headscarf, or having a beard. We've heard about those, I'm afraid, from a number of other witnesses. Mrs. Gallagher, can I ask you, what did the RCN do with the results of the survey?
So the survey was really a snapshot survey to help us understand the sort of experiences of our members at that time. And in early April 2020, this was at a time where we were told there weren't any shortages of PPE. So it allowed us to feed into conversations from a Four Nations perspective to lobby and put pressure on the governments to ensure that the supply of PPE was kept going to keep healthcare workers safe.
I think you said in due course you sent these findings, and indeed the May survey, which we'll come on to Department of Health, UK Prime Minister, the equivalents in the devolved nations, NHS England, and the HSE.
It was widely disseminated, yes.
Did you have any response from any of those organisations to the findings?
So the 4 country responses would have gone back to the respective 4 country directors. My recollection is that there was a limited response, an acknowledgement of the situation, but that would be about it.
Okay. Did you find that there was any improvement in the supply of PPE as the months wore on?
As the months wore on, we didn't really see any particular issues with aprons or gloves, although there were moments when certainly I remember issues with the quality of aprons being an issue. Most of the concerns tended to be around masks and eye protection on an ongoing basis.
Let's look, please, if we may, at the May 2020 survey, and it's INQ 328873. And could I have up on screen page 4, where there's a very helpful summary of the findings. Now, this was conducted over the 7th to the 11th of May 2020. This time, 5,023 replies, and some positive news. Situation has improved across the board in terms of access to standard and high-risk items of PPE. When you say high-risk items, what was being referred to there?
So that would have been respiratory protective equipment, so FFP3s, and potentially, but forgive me, I can't quite remember, long-sleeve gowns.
Right, thank you. 28% of respondents were very confident their employer was doing enough to adequately protect them from COVID. 40% moderately confident. You hadn't asked that the first time round. No criticism, but it's just making the position clear. However, more standard and high-risk PPE are being donated, homemade or self-bought, especially eye face protection, compared to our previous survey. So still by May of 2020, there are concerns about supplies. And what was the position where people donated or made PPE? Was that an acceptable form of PPE to be worn?
So if I just explain some of the issues that could have potentially resulted in that response. The surveys were open to health and adult social care settings. So without having the data in front of me, I couldn't say, but certainly we know that a lot of donations were made to adult social care at the time by the general public and by family members that were concerned about their loved ones going to work. Our position was very clear, and we added this to our frequently asked questions on our website, that whilst we really appreciated donated and homemade items, it was absolutely critical when wearing them in the workplace that they met the right standards of protection.
Over a third of respondents said they felt pressure to care for a patient with possible or confirmed COVID. That's had improved since the April survey. Clearly, there were some general concerns about infection control supplies. And then over half of respondents had raised concerns about PPE, and over a quarter of these were not addressed at all. However, there have been improvements in the concerns that had been addressed fully compared to the previous survey. Now, may I ask you about that, please, Mrs. Gallagher? If you're a nurse on the front line, to whom is it that you should raise concerns initially?
Initially, you should go to your manager in the first place.
And from what's the sort of brief trajectory of an escalation of concerns from the manager up?
So depending on where you work, it would go to a manager, then a senior manager, then go up through the organisation from there in line with the various governance arrangements. Members did report that they had a general lack of confidence in concerns being listened to and acted upon. And in fact, many members admitted to not raising concerns based on that.
That can come down, but one of the things you do say in your statement is that the first PPE survey revealed that staff from ethnic minority groups were more likely to report they did not have access to adequate PPE compared to their colleagues from white British groups. Are you able to help at all as to why there is this apparent disparity?
I can't, based without having the data in front of me. So, for example, I don't know how many of our respondents were working in adult social care or working in the NHS. Also, we do know that some of our colleagues from black and ethnic minority groups are very reluctant to challenge or have a complete lack of confidence in their concerns being raised. And that may well have had an effect on their ability to ask for PPE, whether or not that would have been provided.
Yeah. Well, I think you set out in your statement and you say staff members from ethnic minority groups reported feeling less confident in their employers' ability to protect them from exposure to COVID in comparison with their white British counterparts. Almost a quarter of ethnic minority staff did not feel confident at all, compared to around 1 in 10 white British.
Yes.
And you said staff from ethnic minorities reported they were less likely to have had their concerns addressed in comparison to their white British counterparts.
Yes.
Can I help you, ask you, what does the RCN do? And I'm not suggesting it's solely your responsibility, but is there anything the RCN did to try and ameliorate some of those concerns or improve the position for ethnic minority staff to help them feel confident?
So working through the regions, the organisation, the Royal College of Nursing, has its regional structure, and then we work through our branches, our health and safety and wellbeing representatives and learning representatives. So a huge amount of energy went in to try to reach our black and ethnic minority colleagues through the various communities and where they worked. We also knew that based on where the majority, or the roles that the majority of our colleagues had were in sort of band 5, band 6 roles where they would have had significant patient contact. So some of this may also have been around the demand that they need, the demand to use PPE that simply wasn't being met on the front line as well. So it's a really complex issue, and it's one that we really want to understand in order to build in the experiences of our black and ethnic minority colleagues into future pandemic planning, because it's absolutely critical.
You may have answered my question in part there, because I was going to ask what additional steps could have been taken to try and address some of those disparities. Clearly, planning.
Yes.
But is there anything else that you can perhaps suggest that would make a real practical difference here?
The greater use of collecting data on protected characteristics is something that we're really keen is implemented, both in terms of data on infections or deaths, but also in day-to-day issues to help us understand where some of these challenges are and why they're actually arising. That is counterbalanced slightly by some people not wanting to disclose their ethnicity, and we have to respect that. But it would be really helpful for us to understand that real lived experience of them in the workplace.
Whilst we're dealing with PPE, I think the RCN, is this right, advised its members on its dedicated PPE webpage to not use PPE, which was not fit for purpose. If it didn't fit correctly, is that correct?
Yes.
Didn't meet the correct standards, had degraded, was donated, as we've just looked at, or was dirty or unable to be adequately decontaminated.
Yes.
Now, I think the RCN, is this right, received reports of PPE being removed and staff being challenged when they wore PPE. And it's at your paragraph 45 onwards, Mrs. Gallagher. But there's an email that may bring this to light. Could we have a look, please, at INQ 328902? And could we go to the final page of the document, or page 3? This is an email from Dave Carr at Unite, and it is dated, forgive me, the 21st of January 2021. And if we could just go to, it actually just starts on the bottom of page 2. I'm so sorry. Thank you very much. There you are. Thank you. The recipient had been contacted by several members of staff yesterday, last night and this morning about PPE provision on a ward. Staff have been told at morning handover that they were not allowed to wear FFP3 masks. These masks have been physically removed from PPE stations in the areas discussed. Staff have been told that they will be challenged if caught wearing them. The ward had their FFP3 stock removed to the dismay of the staff working there. I understand is it the head of nursing, HON?
I would say that's probably what it refers to.
In this area has supported the decision to remove FFP3 from non-AGP areas. And then it sets out the trust is following the guidance. The author makes the point we're not asking for FFP universally, although we would be happy with that. We're asking for staff to have the choice to wear the PPE they feel safe with. Incidentally, medical staff in the same environment as nurses are wearing full FFP3 and long-sleeve gowns. This adds even further to the distress and alarm to our nurses, discouraged from doing likewise. And so this, Mr. Carr is raising this with the RCN, and perhaps then if we could scroll up, please, to follow the thread. There we can see you're asked whether you can support this with the RCN's backing. They can't find an easy answer on the PPE pages, just that the RCN has asked for a review of guidance generally. Not sure of the evidence base, but I'd say from experience you can't guarantee the COVID status of anyone you're dealing with, so not having FFP3 does seem to be an extreme measure. And if we go up again, you're copied in.
Yes.
And up again, please. We can see your response. Mark, thanks. This is really timely. It's disappointing to hear staff being responded to in the way described below. I've copied in Jude, who's another colleague at the RCN, for some advice, as I had a conversation today where I discussed with a member barriers to staff requesting FFP3s. The new IPC guidance, NHS not public health, does allow for employers' trust based on local risk assessment to implement a move to the use of FFPs in areas or across the board. If this happens, though, staff must be fit tested. And if we go up again, I think there is an update to what was going on at the hospital concerned. By way of update, we gather the hospital removed the FFP3 as staff were wearing it without being fit tested appropriately. They may bring it back with fit testing in place. That said, there is disparity across London, with some trusts voluntarily providing a higher grade PPE because they recognise it makes staff feel safer. All links into the postcode lottery press release that's been prepared. And so a number of issues in there.
Yes.
It sounds like it was removed, but perhaps not necessarily for the reasons people thought. And it was being removed because there wasn't proper fit testing going on. Is that how you read that chain?
So that's certainly a possibility. As I say, this incident was reported to us. What we know is that there was certainly a lot of misunderstanding around the application of the IPC guidance in practice. There was huge confusion over the hierarchy of controls. And of course, what a lot of people didn't appreciate was that actually the IPC guidance in effect was the minimum level of guidance, and that actually organisations were quite within their rights to go beyond that in areas in line with the employer's overarching risk assessment where there were higher risks to staff. So certain areas such as accident and emergency departments, for example, where lots of people would have been coming in to the organisation, you wouldn't have known what status that they had with COVID or whatever. That would be different perhaps to an outpatient's setting. What this email did really was to highlight the confusion that was in place. And at this time, of course, we had the new variant starting to circulate, which was much more transmissible. So staff were highly anxious around their status and their protection. They knew that FFP3 masks offered a higher degree of protection. They clearly identified they needed to use them in that area in line with their dynamic risk assessment, which sounds complicated, but in fact it's not if the employer has done their risk assessment appropriately. And actually their confidence would have been decimated to have those masks removed or fit testing not provided.
Can I just ask you about the risk assessments? Because I think in your statement you say that the RCN subsequently worked on developing its own COVID-19 risk assessment. Why did the RCN do it its own?
We came to the decision to create a toolkit, so not guidance, but a toolkit, after we had tried for some time to influence the IPC guidance and how it described the level of protection that could be used in different situations. We wrote the guidance with stakeholders rather than it just being a nursing document, because this clearly should have been available to all and was available to all. What we wanted to do, because we had realised by the end of June 2021 that there was no way we were going to be successful in influencing any changes to the IPC guidance. So our thinking and our decision making turned to improving education and awareness on how to actually implement risk assessment and think about Kosh in the workplace. Kosh in particular is something that many nurses haven't historically thought about on a day-to-day basis. And where they would have considered Kosh, it would have been in specific instances, such as working in endoscopy with disinfectants or when cleaning up spillages of blood and body fluids and using chemicals for those. The use of Kosh as applied to a biological hazard, so a virus in this situation, is something that very, very few people outside of laboratory settings would have had to have considered. So their knowledge, their confidence in this, and then to put it into practice with a risk assessment was minimal. So that's why we did our risk assessment toolkit.
Thank you.
I can't remember if you did explain earlier, but for those who don't know, Kosh is the control
of substances hazardous health. That's correct.
And may we, after the break, please, come on to just a look at some of that IPC guidance and some of the problems you've just alluded to.
Very well, I shall return at midday.
All right.
Thank you, my lady. Mrs. Gallagher, can I ask you, please, about the IPC guidance? And you've hinted at some of the RCN's concerns already, which I hope I may do justice by saying it was a major concern of the RCN's that the IPC guidance did not make sufficient or limited reference to HSE requirements. And I just want to try and understand, why does the RCN say it's so important, for example, to refer to health and safety executive requirements or Kosh, as we were just talking about before the break?
Our position was and remains that IPC guidance does not exist in isolation. So IPC guidance not only has to be implemented in the context of where a healthcare worker is working, but it also has to align and reflect the needs of other legislation or regulations. Given that many healthcare workers were not familiar in the way that they needed to become familiar with Kosh and health and safety legislation, we felt that just having a single reference to refer to health and safety was not helpful. So our expectation would have been that there either would have been an appendix or there would have been signposting, not to a website, but to practical or to guidance in a practical way that healthcare workers can relate to help them relate the IPC guidance to the implementation of Kosh.
May I ask you about that, though? Because one of the things we've heard, obviously, the guidance changed a lot throughout the pandemic, and the difficulties of keeping up with the guidance is something that's been raised. How practically helpful is it to give yet more information to the healthcare workers by way of an appendix, perhaps, as you just suggested?
I would have liked to have seen that at the beginning. So when SARS-CoV-2 was downgraded from a high-consequence infectious disease, which would have happened at some point in the pandemic. We all accept that's a natural part of the process. that first iteration of guidance was absolutely critical because it set the bar for what would follow, given that learning would take place and guidance would inevitably be adapted over time. So March 2020 would have been the time to really put additional resources, FAQs, guidance, tips for whatever it was, in that then would have guided employers, managers and healthcare workers through the rest of the pandemic.
Would it have been too late to have done it later in the pandemic, or perhaps between waves 1 and waves 2?
Well, providing information is always helpful, but that first iteration, because everything falls from the IPC guidance, you know, assumptions around demand fall from the IPC guidance. So, for example, being able to understand the demand for PPE, taking into account that individual healthcare workers would at times need to consider the risk to them and perhaps use an FFP3 mask instead of a surgical face mask, for example. That could have had a profound impact on the modelling for PPE supply, rather than just referring people to the IPC guidance, which felt very flat and a one-size-fits-all.
May I ask you about one particular piece of guidance? We know that there was, in April 2020, the acute shortages guidance that came out. Particularly at that time, we've heard there was a real shortage of gowns at that time. And that guidance, in short, advised sessional use of some PPE or reuse of some PPE. And I think the guidance said that the HSE had approved that where it was safe to do so, where there were acute shortages. And you make the point in your statement, Mrs. Gallagher, that that guidance was developed without full and formal consultation with the RCN, and that the RCN did not support that guidance. And
that's correct.
Why did the RCN take that position?
The RCN, I mean, this is after the fact, but we were really surprised at the speed at which this guidance was developed, and also surprised that the shortages of PPE hadn't really been considered and built in at an early stage. So it would be completely understandable and expected, given the global supply chain demands, that we would run short of PPE. It was never going to be perfect all the time. If this guidance, this concern had been addressed earlier with multi-professional stakeholders, including nurses, because it wasn't just us that were facing risks, our other colleagues were as well, then that would have given us an opportunity to think about the types of messages we might need to give to our members, what sort of questions, you know, to prepare answers for when they were concerned. But given that we had had shortages of PPE, as identified in our survey, and then members were asked to reuse PPE potentially, it just added to the concern and added to the confusion and further eroded that confidence around, am I really protected when I'm going to work to do my job, which I want to do, to look after my patients, but I am at a huge risk from getting an infection.
It might be said by those that bought it in that they needed to do it at such speed,
yes,
because there was such a shortage, and so they had to do something to try and breach the gap.
Yes.
But when it came out, how did it go down with the RCN's members?
So RCN members were really concerned, and our country directors in particular were really concerned. And in fact, the other nations, so Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, chose not to accept the acute shortages guidance and relied instead on their supply of PPE. So this was predominantly an England only issue, for want of a better word. Although the technical aspects of reusing or decontaminating PPE were considered, and indeed with some of my decontamination colleagues, actually what didn't really follow was good communication and explanations around that, and that was the main concern of our members.
I think you say in your statement that Dame Donna Kinnair, who was the chief executive of the RCN at the time, wrote to the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, who was in fact cited on the acute shortages guidance, as I understand it, and indeed the chief executive of Public Health England, raising concerns about the lack of consultation with the RCN and advising both the Secretary of State and the chief executive that the RCN did not endorse the guidance.
Yes.
Do you know whether there was any response from the Secretary of State and or the Chief Executive of PHE?
I don't, sorry.
Okay. It's not to say there wasn't one.
Yes,
you
but
don't
I
know.
can't recall. I can't recall one.
Had the RCN and other interested parties been consulted, Ms. Gallagher, what difference would it have made to the guidance as it went out?
So we would not have, well, I may have had some views on how PPE could be reused and what was safe to do and what wasn't safe to do. But this was around helping our healthcare workers stay confident. I to this day don't understand how considering shortages of PPE wasn't taken into account at a far earlier stage, and then thinking and engagement around how we might broach this really difficult subject would have been thought about a lot earlier, because to do it in what was in effect, I think, about 48 hours is incredibly fast, and people are working at pace with other demands at the same time. So it was just incredible that, as the largest part of the workforce, and that nurses were using predominantly the most PPE, we weren't engaged in that discussion.
That I understand as a principle, that obviously
Yes.
as the people who are most affected, you should have been consulted. I understand that. But my question really is, what difference would there have been to the guidance if you had been consulted?
There probably wouldn't have been any difference in terms of the technical aspects of the guidance. We may have had some comments around how healthcare workers could have stored their masks safely, knowing how people can put things in pockets, what to do, what not to do, things like that. And looking at what might happen in different care settings rather than just an NHS hospital. But the technical aspects probably would not have changed, but we would have been able to support potentially, given the situation, if we had been able to look at communication and things like that. I do feel, though, that the position of the RCN would have remained reflective of the position of the other countries, in that we needed to keep the PPE supplies coming in rather than potentially rely on reusing PPE as a stopgap or to keep the PPE going.
Well, I've got one other question that I was going to ask anyway, but it's arisen. You say the other countries, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, didn't accept the guidance, so what happened? What happened?
They chose not to implement the shortages guidance, so they maintained their efforts, as I understand it, on having the PPE supplies continuing to come through. So there wasn't a need for them to implement it. And in fact, they didn't advise that that's what healthcare workers did.
Sorry, yet one more question. But surely in England, they carried on trying to get supplies?
They did. So the acute shortages guidance was written. Forgive me, but I'm not aware that it was ever really implemented. They were getting really, really close to running out of PPE, so they had to have something in place to do that.
I think my lady may recall that when the Chief Nursing Officer gave evidence, Northern Ireland sent 25,000 gowns over to England to try and stem the problem. And as I understand it, the shortages were not so acute in the other nations that they required the guidance. But
there was an issue of mutual aid between the countries as well as between NHS organisations, and somehow they managed to keep things going.
Thank you. Mrs. Gallagher, it's my fault I asked you a bad question, but I think, in fact, in your statement you do go on to set out that PHE did, in fact, respond to Dame Donna's concerns. Dame Donna had asked them for the evidence base on which the acute shortages guidance was issued.
That's right, yes.
And although the PHE indicated that they were worried about the concerns that the RCN had raised, they did not provide the evidence base that Dame Donna had requested. Now, can I ask you, though, about some guidance that did come from the RCN, which was that I think given that there were concerns about availability of PPE, RCN published guidance to its members regarding refusal to treat.
Yes.
And could we have a look, please, on screen at INQ 328905? And may I, before we descend to perhaps some of the detail there, why was it necessary for the RCN to publish a guidance which might be telling nurses you don't have to treat people in certain circumstances?
We had been having an increasing number of concerns raised by members and had actually published guidance on PPE, am I safe, in the wake of the shortages, guidance, and also given the ongoing flux, I suppose, in terms of supply of PPE. This really came to a head, and in particular, Northern Ireland had a specific concern around the supply of PPE in discussions with the First Minister in Northern Ireland. So my recollection is that we brought this issue back because it was starting to be raised, and rather than wait for members to potentially refuse to treat patients, we would issue guidance on what needed to be considered, given this huge tension around protecting the patient and protecting the healthcare worker and what this actually meant in practice. Our professional code takes precedence, so this is not about somebody just walking into work and suddenly refusing to treat patients. There is a process to go through, and there are implications for healthcare workers should they actually find themselves in that situation. But given that, what I would say, and what our members were also aware of in some settings, was that a precedent already existed in terms of what healthcare workers should consider and could do if they found themselves in danger. So an example would be a community nurse, for example, going into a patient's home where weapons were present. If the healthcare worker felt themselves to be in danger, she could withdraw, and then there was a process to follow. So this was really an extension of that, and also the precedent that exists in other professions when faced with danger.
All right, now this came, I think, out on the 9th of April of 2020. And can we just go to page 2? Because at box 6, there's various steps that the RCN are urging the member to consider before getting to this stage. And it says, but at box 6, ultimately, if you exhausted all other measures to reduce the risk and you have not been given appropriate PPE in line with the UK IPC guidance, you are entitled to refuse work. This will be a last resort, and the RCN recognises what a difficult step this would be for nursing staff. And you advise them to talk to local reps or indeed phone a telephone number to take advice.
Yes.
Do you know if any nurses did, in fact, refuse to treat?
To the best of my knowledge, no nurses did.
And was there any criticism of perhaps those who were talking about refusing to treat or thinking about potentially following and implementing this guidance?
It was an incredibly difficult subject to have conversations with people about. Clearly, even when considering the potential to not provide care to patients, that is incredibly difficult for nurses to do. And obviously the other issues were around how their colleagues may feel in the same areas and things like that, as well as the implications from a managerial perspective. But by writing this guidance, it was available as a resource for people to read and think through in a structured way, rather than go into the workplace and perhaps make a rash decision, which is not what we wanted our members to do.
Well, in fact, if we just scroll down on the guidance, you can see there that the implications of a lack of PPE, and if you refused to treat, there were potential legal consequences from dismissal, action taken by the regulators,
Yes.
clinical negligence, inquests, or indeed, it may well be rare, but potential criminal charges
That's
to follow.
correct.
All right, so
Yes.
it was setting out fairly and squarely, if I may put it
Yes.
like that, that these are the difficult steps you have to consider, but there are also potentially ramifications if you do, in fact, refuse to treat.
And it was our responsibility to make our members very clear that that whilst, you know, you may be in an untenable position, actually there is a process and there are implications if you go down that line. This is a really important point for me in terms of learning and future planning for the pandemic, is how we start to consider these issues for the next incident that occurs, and how we broach these really difficult conversations and this tension. Because if our healthcare workers are getting infected and are unable to work on one level, obviously there's the more serious harm that can occur. Then how do we manage the public's expectations and have that conversation around this really difficult ethical issue?
That document can come down, please. Can I turn to a slightly different topic, and that of fit testing?
Yes.
I think in your statement you make the observation, obviously, that we are aware there needs to be a fit test for FFP3. There were reports, is this right, of up to sometimes 17 different types
That's
of
correct.
mask within one trust,
Yes.
each of which has to be fit tested.
Yes.
And you say in your statement that some brands of FFP3 do not appropriately fit female faces.
That's correct.
And that's been raised with the British Safety Industry Federation. Can you help me out? Is there any work being done to try and broaden the numbers of types of FFP3 to fit female faces, those wearing beards, all the other different problems that we've heard of?
So there is an issue in that the use of respiratory protective equipment in healthcare historically has not been something that has been widespread. It's been something that we've used when nursing particular patients with, for example, TB or other infections, but generally it's not widely used. And we lost an opportunity after the swine flu pandemic to actually build that into our planning. The FFP3 masks that we have are built on something called the Sheffield man face. So a white man about age 50 with a certain face shape. And of course, we all don't fit that shape. So what we need, I'm not aware of any specific work that's going on in a structured way around looking at this, but certainly from our perspective in terms of recommendations and learning, we need personal protective equipment, respiratory protective equipment that will enable us to do our job safely. At the moment, we have only what is provided, which is predominantly single-use FFP3, that apart from the fact that it doesn't fit everyone, and there are huge practical problems with fit testing, it's not sustainable and the wastage is huge. So reusable respiratory protective equipment, our members are suggesting is the way forward should we need it. We need innovation at pace to find and test designs that are not only acceptable to nurses, but are acceptable to our patients and can enable lip reading and some of the practical care provision, and also that we involve the public because they will be the recipients of healthcare workers wearing these masks. So it's a huge piece of work, but one I think that the UK would really benefit from in terms of preparing us in the future, whatever that design looks like.
And I presume from what you've said that answer would apply equally to some of the problems we've heard with ethnic minority healthcare workers
Absolutely.
not having sufficient supplies of PPE that fit them.
And we would clearly need to take their views and their input into the design and everything alongside, both for ethnicity, to meet ethnicity needs, but also religious needs, as you've said.
I think you're aware that we have heard from Professor Dinah Gold in relation to the independent review that the RCN commissioned her to undertake. So I don't need to ask you about that, Mrs. Gallagher. And also, we've heard from the Resuscitation Council in relation to AGPs and what was or wasn't deemed to be an AGP. And so I don't need to ask you about that, but I just say that so that if anyone is following, wants to look when the statement is published, there are various sections in your statement dealing with that. Can I just ask you this? In your statement, you set out over 25 or so pages a chronology of the RCN's concerns that were raised with government, with the IPC cell, with other bodies, other stakeholders, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but there are some topics I'd like to ask you about, please. Clearly, you say, have told us already that certainly in the beginning of the pandemic, there was concerns raised across all 4 nations about the lack of PPE in March 2020 going into April 2020. And I think, is this right, that Dame Donna wrote to the Prime Minister on the 23rd of March, raising concerns. There was a similar letter sent to the First Minister of Scotland, and indeed one to the Welsh Minister. And indeed, in relation to the Welsh Minister, there was concerns about PPE being of poor quality. So not just the lack of it, but the quality of it once it was available. And perhaps we could just put up on screen the letter to Vaughan Gething. It's at 417538. It's from the Royal College of Nursing's branch in Wales. 27th of March, we'd just gone into lockdown. The author, Helen Wiley, who's the director of RCN Wales, wrote to the Minister and said that there was concerns. Firstly, the guidance is not clear and is causing confusion. Changes in approaches has made staff confused and not trusting of the guidance, as I think you've already alluded to in your evidence. What has been extremely challenging is the constant change in advice guidelines, particularly in relation to PPE. Whilst we are sending out updated advice, this is causing anxiety with people, as whilst we're being totally transparent, people's confidence in the system is being eroded. Now, may I just ask you about that? Because there is a tension. The guidance needs to be updated as and when there are perhaps acute shortages, as we've just been discussing, or change in the routes of transmission in due course. How do you balance the need to keep people updated without overburdening them with ever-changing guidelines?
What I found in my experience is that nurses understand that the guidance will need to change over time. Their real concern in phase 1 of the pandemic was that the guidance changes always came out on a Friday afternoon, and there was a massive scramble to try and get the guidance changed and implemented locally by the Monday. And the communication around why the guidance was changing, so the rationale for that to aid the communication and reassure people's anxiety, they felt was lacking. So that was a major concern there. Of course, the guidance will change. Our members, I feel, would have been reassured if they felt we were around the table. Now, that may have resulted in criticism for us if they didn't agree with what the guidance said. But there was, by that time, their confidence was, as the letter says, really becoming eroded.
Can I just ask you about something you said there? You mentioned the guidance coming out on a Friday afternoon, and we heard from a witness from the RCN just before you gave evidence who said it seemed ridiculous that I needed to wear a mask on Monday, and I was given a weekend of not wearing a mask and therefore being at risk. How practically possible would it have been for a guidance to come out on a Friday afternoon saying, from now, masks have got to be worn? Is that realistic for the trusts and all of the other settings to be able to bring in mask wearing as forthwith?
It was incredibly difficult. So some of that may have been something around making sure the supplies were in place. I don't know. What I do know is that infection prevention and control specialist nurses found themselves really stuck in the middle of trying to implement the guidance that was coming down from the UK infection prevention and control guidance, and then implementing it in practice to meet the needs of the board and senior managers so they could say they were complying with the guidance, whilst dealing with healthcare workers on the ground who were asking them many, many questions about why that was, and asking for explanations. And those infection prevention and control nurses often didn't have the answers. So there was a huge amount of pressure within the system at all levels to implement the guidance quickly and at pace.
I think just to finish off with this letter, can we go to the second page, please, and the section beginning PPE is of poor quality, unsuitable. It's very poorly produced, is one size. So, for example, the visors fall off. That doesn't instill confidence. Staff fit test one mask and then get issued with a different type of mask and have to fit test again. Yes. No one has capacity to keep doing that. We fit test with one mask and get issued with a different type. FFP3 only to be used in certain procedures. There are only 30 masks given for a team of 30. So we have to wear basic fluid repellent masks. And basically our PPE is an apron, short gloves, fluid repellent theatre mask, and what I've described as Christmas cracker glasses. So fairly clearly telling the Welsh Minister.
I think this was a draft letter. There's a draft water print through, so you have to forgive me. I don't know if this letter actually went, but what it's doing is really describing the reality on the ground of the challenges that were being faced in relation to PPE provision, and many of the issues that are mentioned here are actually reflective of what happened in the other countries as well.
Statement doesn't say it's draft, but perhaps you can clarify if we need to. Certainly, Mr. Gething.
Sorry, I saw the watermark on the previous
not at all.
page.
If it is draft, we'll deal with that by way of correction. But the statement says that was the letter that was sent, and he responded a couple of weeks later, noting the Welsh Government were working hard to have extra supplies of PPE. You say that the Prime Minister didn't respond to Dame Donna's letter. The Scottish Minister did respond to the letter that went to Scotland, and in relation to Northern Ireland, letters were sent to the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, I think is this correct, about lack of PPE. There was a holding response that the department was not in a position to respond due to volume of work.
That's correct.
But the letter had been sent to what was described as the lead policy official.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. That document can be taken off the screen. And may I ask you, please, about one aspect of the chronology that you mention in your statement. It's at paragraph 176, Mrs. Gallagher. Yeah, in November 2020, and the RCN wrote that month to NHS England asking for clarification about the IPC guidance. We reiterated our concerns that while the recent publication of guidance for domestic settings implied airborne transmission, IPC guidance and policy did not seem to align with this in a clinical setting, which had caused confusion and questions to be asked about the risk in healthcare settings. Can you just summarise, please, why it was that the RCN wanted the IPC guidance to make clear whether there was airborne transmission or implied airborne transmission? Why was it so important for your members?
So our members, nurses, healthcare support workers, cadet nurses, students, are members of the public that happen to be nursing professionals. So when they saw the Cabinet Office video talking about the need to open windows, have good ventilation because COVID was airborne, that led them to reflect on that in their own domestic settings, or perhaps if they were going to patients' own homes, and then to consider the stark difference in hospital settings, where actually we have no particular ventilation unless you're in specific areas like operating theatres, bone marrow transplants, ITUs, for example. So nurses knew that there was no ventilation in hospitals. Our ability to open windows generally is extremely restricted. So these are stuffy hot environment. So when they looked at the video and reflected on what that meant where they worked, they noted the difference there. So if COVID-19 was in fact airborne, which was the challenge that they put to us, then that meant that it had implications for the infection prevention and control guidance on one hand, but also what was the NHS estate going to do to make it safe by improving the ventilation or looking at other technologies that could support it to let COVID out, which was what the public were being advised to do.
Well, I think those concerns, I'm afraid, remained extant, I think, in January of 2021, when Dame Donna wrote to, I think, the Chair of Public Health England, cautioning them against groupthink.
Yes, that's correct.
And indeed
Yes.
continued until, I think, May 2021, when the RCN issued a press release. And can I have up on screen, please, INQ 114429. The concern in the press release was the global recognition that COVID is airborne shows the UK is lagging behind. And there is reference in there to the alliance members, which includes the RCN, AGP Alliance, the Fresh Air NHS, writing to the Prime Minister to express their concerns. They say the response they received from Number 10 failed to recognise the growing evidence the virus can be spread in tiny particles known as aerosols. And then there was reference to SAGE, the WHO, and I think the CDC in the States beginning to recognise airborne transmission. Yet UK guidance only recommends the use of higher grade FFP3 respiratory masks for a limited range of procedures. Why did the RCN take such steps as to make a press release like this, which is fairly critical, I think it's fair to say?
It is. I mean, the concerns were because we had seen at least 2 new variants by that time, each one increasing in transmissibility. And a healthcare worker, well, nursing workforce that was really starting to become affected by long COVID, and also the rates of healthcare-acquired COVID-19 along with our patients. So we had been really trying to influence behind the scenes since November, December 2020 to have the IPC guidance changed, and really it was a case of a last-ditch attempt to try and get the issue discussed in the open and to try and influence change, but we weren't able to do that, despite the fact that, as you said, the UK guidance was contrary to other guidance, including within Europe by ECDC.
May I ask you, thank you, that document can be taken down. May I ask you about one thing you do say in your statement was that at times, certainly at the end of December 2020, there were obviously enormous pressures on IPC staff, and there was concern, there was some non-adherence to IPC guidance. Yes. How did that get reported back to the RCN, the non-adherence?
We didn't actually hear much about the non-adherence to IPC measures until we received the communications from NHS England. What we did know was that there were many nurses and other healthcare workers off sick. We knew that staff were by now extremely tired, and all the existing literature, not about COVID, but about the state of the workforce, points to how missed episodes of care or mistakes or errors can be made if you are short-staffed or are looking after too many patients. So when we received that information from NHS England, I wasn't surprised that there was concerns being raised around a lack of adherence to infection prevention and control guidelines, which are clearly the gold standard that you would expect. But actually what hadn't been taken into account was the state of the workforce and how it was really struggling to do the right thing at that time. So what our members subsequently told us was that they felt blamed for increasing rates of healthcare-acquired infection, predominantly COVID-19, but in fact they were decimated as a workforce and didn't have the time or capacity to do the right thing.
Did the RCN take any steps itself to try and reinforce the need for compliance?
We were invited to review, to go to a meeting and to review a survey that was planned to go out in early January. We reviewed the survey, but actually the questioning, the way that the questions were posed, we felt wasn't helpful to members, and in fact it could result in healthcare workers being blamed even more for increasing rates of healthcare-associated infections.
May I change topic, please, Mrs. Gallagher, and ask you about the reporting of data relating to the deaths of healthcare workers and nurses in particular. If it helps you, I'm at around paragraph 130 onwards in your report. But in short, we've already heard there are difficulties with ascertaining a precise number of deaths of healthcare workers. Why do the RCN say it's so important that this data should be collected?
Despite the fact that you're in a pandemic, which is clearly a chaotic and very busy situation, data is absolutely critical to give you an indication over time on what the situation is, but also to be able to adapt and change practices if needed. So the data that was provided on healthcare worker infections, although it was reported as initial data a bit more frequently than it was published, it was extremely lagging. So it was reported, published monthly, but reported quarterly. So that meant that if organisations were trying to adapt and put in place interventions, so for example, some organisations moved their healthcare workers to wearing FFP3s for all suspected or known patients with COVID-19, then actually understanding the impact of that on healthcare worker infections, that data is absolutely critical. And likewise, to support learning after the event, we need good data so we can build that into future planning and our future understanding of what worked well and what didn't work well.
I think you say in your statement that you think data ought to be collected as well from non-NHS organisations. Who did you have in mind?
So for our membership includes, as I said before, nurses working in independent healthcare settings and adult social care. So I would include all the data from those settings as well.
And can I ask you, Mrs. Gallagher, who do you think should be the body or the organisation to actually collate this data?
That's a really important question, and the honest answer is I don't know, given the current organisations we have and their roles and remits. I would not suggest, and this is my personal view, that it is not the role of UKHSA, because we are not talking about surveillance data per se. They may disagree. I don't believe it's the role of the Health and Safety Executive. Our suggestion would be that we need to consider how we can collect data from a UK perspective in a standardised way as a minimum data set. Perhaps it needs an independent organisation, but something where we can all feed in digitally in real time and then look to clarify the data afterwards.
And presumably make it comparable across all 4 nations. So we are
really
comparing
needs
like with like.
Yes, we understood that the data was collected and reported in slightly different ways across the 4 nations. And that wasn't always helpful in trying to get a sense of what was going on from a UK perspective. So, yes, a standardised minimum set across the UK that everybody feeds into, but then everyone can use that data to suit their needs.
That brings me to recommendations, please. And I'd like to ask you about a number of them that you've set out in your statement. Clearly, data for those healthcare workers that died is one of them. I think you advocate for nursing input into the IPC guidance, including early on in a pandemic.
Yes.
Right. And we've looked at that. Can I ask you about this, though? You recommend that there is input from non-IPC specialists when producing future IPC guidance, including health and safety experts, occupational hygienists, aerosol scientists, occupational health and wider professional stakeholders such as paramedics, speech and language therapists. A number of people there that you would advocate for being involved in the guidance. Can I ask you this though, might that be actually a danger of too many people being involved in it so that you don't turn it round as quickly as one needs to do, particularly at the beginning of a pandemic?
We may need to look at how we write guidance in a slightly different way. But I absolutely believe that these non-IP specialists are critical in terms of shaping guidance. Their input would, I imagine, be different in different ways. But certainly, from my experience in clinical practice, I heavily relied on my authorised engineers for decontamination, my health and safety leads, experts in other areas, estates and facilities, to help me make sure that the infection control policies that we were writing were set in the right context and able to be implemented. And the same would apply, but on a national basis. So it may not be a small group that write the guidance, but that doesn't mean that everyone has to be around the table at one time. There are different ways of working. And the most important thing for me, as I've said before, is that infection control guidance has to be implemented in context. So one size fits all doesn't necessarily work. So whilst you may not have an aerosol scientist working in a prison, for example, they would be able to take the principles and look at what that meant in different care settings with professionals.
One other recommendation that you would urge Her Ladyship to consider is funding for the urgent development of reusable RPE that is acceptable to staff and patients.
Yes.
Help us with why you urge that recommendation. And when you say is acceptable to staff and patients, what do you mean by that?
So we have to be prepared for future pandemics. There will be a future pandemic, and it may well be one that is another respiratory virus, whatever that is. It may not be, it could be something else. But in terms of protecting us from infection where we are inhaling the pathogen, we need protective equipment. So our experience from this pandemic is that constantly fit testing and looking for multiple types, or trying to draw on global supplies of FFP3s, wastes a huge amount of energy and resources. We need to train our healthcare workers to become more accustomed to the wearing of respiratory protective equipment in the future. So we need to find a solution that is comfortable, that both in terms of being able to breathe, but also heat, because our workforce is predominantly female, and there are particular issues for the female workforce. We need to be visible. As I said before, we need to be able to lip read, or patients to lip read for us, and to have our own equipment that we take responsibility for, rather than a shared pool of equipment, which our members were very clear that they did not want, is something that we need to look at in the future. But the design needs to involve many stakeholders, our patients and the public, and is an area where I think it would make a huge difference in the future.
Final question from me, please. We often hear lots about what didn't work well during the pandemic. Are there any aspects of the healthcare system's response that you think did work well that we should adopt in the event of a future pandemic?
I was really impressed at how the nursing workforce, both those that were employed at the time, but those that came back from retirement, actually responded to the pandemic, and also the public's response in terms of supporting us with that. So that worked extremely well, but in order to maintain it, that workforce needs to be confident. So we need to address the learning rapidly to support that. There was a real sense of camaraderie, and from my personal perspective, I'm incredibly grateful to all those that supported me through intelligence and guidance and answered my endless questions and the check-ins that came with assuring me that what we advised as the RCN, or what the RCN needed to consider, was both appropriate and relevant and the right thing to do. So I'm very grateful to them.
My lady, those are all the questions I asked. There are some questions from core participants.
There are. Ms Peacock. Behind you, Mrs Gallagher, but if you could make sure your answers go into the microphone, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I ask questions on behalf of the Trades Union Congress. My questions relate to the reporting of COVID-19 infections in healthcare workers to the Health and Safety Executive, which you've of course touched upon already. You explain in your witness statement, I'm just going to return to it at paragraph 133, that revised riddle guidance produced by the HSE on 17th of April 2020 had the effect of requiring definitive evidence that COVID-19 was contracted as a result of exposure in the workplace. You set out the threshold and go on to say, this revised guidance stipulated that it was most likely, even in a healthcare setting, that a case of COVID-19 would have been contracted in the community rather than the workplace. The HSE has disclosed to this inquiry the numbers of riddle reports received by the HSE from NHS employers between two dates, and that's the 16th of May 2021 and the 19th of February 2022. The data they've disclosed shows that between those two dates, out of the 98 NHS employers listed, 51 made 3 or fewer riddle reports in total for infections and fatalities. And just for reference for others, that is at INQ 000269831 at Table 1. So just reflecting on that evidence, and given what you've set out about the threshold for making a riddle report, and the guidance that went with that, does it surprise you that riddle reporting was so low in so many trusts?
It does. And the fact that we have this huge variation in reporting, given that the whole of the UK was impacted by COVID-19, to me means that, well, our expectation would have been that the Health and Safety Executive would look at why there was this variation. And was it down to people not understanding the change in requirements for riddle reporting, or was it in fact down to some other form of bias that was present in the system? So, yes.
And just reflecting on the fact that the guidance came with a warning that it was most likely contracted outside of the workplace setting, is it fair to say that there are elements of the guidance that are in a sense dissuading employers from making a report?
Yes, the conditions, as I recall it, that were required for riddle reporting were felt to be very limiting in health and care settings. And the reality would be that, in fact, very few patients would, for example, rip the face mask off the front of the healthcare worker. It also meant that if it was acquired at work, that there could potentially be questions and insinuations around whether staff were and managers were complying with the PPE guidance through the IPC guidance. So it was a very difficult situation, and certainly in terms, it wasn't felt to be helpful for our members in terms of collating data in the first place.
And do you have a view as to what the threshold or the guidance around making a riddle report to HSE should have been, or as to how the guidance should have been different?
I can't comment on that specifically. It's not my area of expertise. But what I can say is for future incidents, the recommendation I would make is that we need to think very carefully about whether or not riddle reporting is actually helpful in those situations, or whether we need other forms of data to support us, and the role of the Health and Safety Executive, which they would of course continue to have. What would be better in a different situation?
So we need to really rethink the system and consider whether more wholesale reporting of infections is required. I'm grateful. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Peacock. Mr Thomas. Mr Thomas is also behind you.
Morning.
I'm representing the FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. In your witness statement, at paragraph 128, you address concerns raised by ethnic minority members of the RCN regarding inappropriate treatment during the pandemic, and you note that the draft reduction framework was viewed as lacking cultural sensitivity and did not include comprehensive equality impact assessments. Yeah? So here's my question. When the RCN launched its own toolkit in December 2021, how did it address these identified shortcomings?
Are you referring to the risk assessment toolkit?
Yes.
Yes. When we developed this toolkit, as I said before, it was very much focused on Kosh, but we were very mindful of how to support our Black and ethnic minority members in terms of supporting their awareness raising, but also how they could raise concerns in the workplace. Have I gone off track?
No, I'm listening to you.
So we focused it very much on the process that was there, but put a lot of effort into communication through our branches, through our representatives, in helping to raise awareness across our membership. So the toolkit was applicable to all members, but recognising that some members felt very challenged in terms of raising concerns, as we'd identified in our PPE survey.
Okay, well, just touching and following on from that, were specific measures implemented to ensure that the toolkit was culturally sensitive and could be adapted to meet the diverse needs of healthcare workers from varied backgrounds?
In the process of developing and publishing the toolkit, we have an internal quality assurance process, and that quality assurance process has a number of criteria, and one of those is to undertake an equality and diversity assessment. So that equality and diversity assessment was done as part of the process prior to publication of the toolkit. And that assessment takes into account existing evidence, how we worked with our stakeholders around that, and how we implemented learning from previous incidents. So I hope that goes some way to answering your question.
Let me move on to my next question. The RCN conducted extensive surveys as early as April-May 2020.
Yes.
Could you explain why, despite this early data collection, the toolkit was not launched until December 2021?
The risk assessment toolkit really came about specifically after we had exhausted all other efforts to try and have the infection prevention and control guidance amended. So it was after June 2021 that we took the decision to put our energy into supporting people specifically around the risk assessment process. This was predominantly because in many communications and conversations, we were constantly referred to the hierarchy of controls within the infection prevention and control guidance, which forms part of that risk assessment process. So the reason we didn't implement the toolkit earlier was because our attention was focused on trying to influence the guidance rather than specifically risk assessment.
You would agree that timing was crucial, though?
I would.
Let me move on to my last question. Were there specific challenges or constraints that contributed to this delay? And in retrospect, what steps might be taken to ensure that similar resources are made available more swiftly in a future health crisis?
If I can answer the second bit first. So our learning from this and recommendations we would make is that we need to educate and raise awareness amongst the whole of our workforce on what risk assessment means in practice, and in particular what it means in the context of biological harms as opposed to perhaps chemicals that we might use in practice. So we need to look at what's needed and how we do that, and perhaps who should be leading and implementing that. Could you repeat the first part of your question? Sorry.
The first part of the question is,
were there specific challenges or constraints? Have you found it?
Yeah, I have. Were there specific challenges or constraints that contributed to the delay?
Not specifically. We were trying to focus, because everything fell from the IPC guidance. So that became our main focus to try and amend and get adapted. It did include some reference to expanding health and safety, content within the guidance, but that took up most of our concentration in the early stages of the pandemic. And it wasn't, as I said, until we felt we had exhausted that we felt we needed to produce something different. We looked at a number of options, and the toolkit was something that was the final sort of decision that we came to around that.
Thank you, Milady. Thank you.
Thank you.
Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Thomas. You're okay to return this afternoon?
I am.
Mrs. Gallagher, you're warned. I shall return at 2:00 this afternoon.